Hi there everyone, and welcome to another week of the good news according to Job. I hope you're excited to jump into this next passage. I am particularly excited because it marks the end of this next cycle, of the second cycle of Job. So as we turn to Job 21 this week, we hear Job's response, and it marks the end of the second cycle. And this is exciting because as we shift into the final cycle, we'll see how it draws a close to the discourses that have been taking place between Job and the three friends. But as for this week, I want us to pick up just on the language that Job uses and how his argument becomes almost so strengthened to say and to argue his point in a way that really challenges the friends, but also resonates with us from a New Testament perspective. As he speaks this, as we look at the passage and what he says, it speaks to us in a very similar voice that we actually have heard today. And so, before I read this passage, I actually want to quote something for us from the New Testament. So what I'm going to read for us is out of the Sermon on the Mount. And it is a piece of the Sermon on the Mount, so obviously there's a lot surrounding what I'm about to read. But it is this what Jesus says here in Matthew 5, verse 43 onwards. And I'm just going to read a portion of it. But listen to these words. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Right, so that's an interesting thing. That's a bit of the context of what Jesus is saying there. And he is talking to us about, obviously, particularly about loving both your neighbor as well as your enemy. But it's the next thing that he says here that is a truth that resonates over not just the truth for loving your neighbor, but even a broader truth when we consider Job 21. He says this: "He, being God, causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Now, that's not to say that there's an excuse in your righteousness or your unrighteousness, or however you want to look at it. But what Jesus is highlighting there is that God is over all things. And whether you're wicked or evil, he will still allow the sun to rise, and he still brings rain. But obviously, in the context of that, it's the end product. It's where you end up in the life that you live that will ultimately be judged at the end of time. But what's significant about that verse, or the verse and a half there that we just pick up on, is the language that's used about God allowing the sun to rise on both the righteous and the unrighteous, or the wicked and the righteous. But then also on the just and the unjust, he brings rain. And Job 21 really captures that the wording in many ways that Jesus uses there. And those words that we read in Matthew summarize in a big sense what we read in Job 21. So as we work through Job 21, maybe you will pick up on some of those ideas that Job is trying to convey. And so I'm going to read through it for us quickly, and listen to the language that Job uses and see if you can pick up on some of those ideas. So Job 21 verse 1. "Then Job replied, 'Listen carefully to my words. Let this be the consolation you give me. Bear with me while I speak, and after I've spoken, mock on. Is my complaint directed to a human being? Why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be appalled. Clap your hand over your mouth. When I think about this, I am terrified. Trembling seizes my body. Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power? They see their children established around them, their offspring before their eyes. Their homes are safe and free from fear. The rod of God is not on them. Their bulls never fail to breed, their cows calve and do not miscarry. They send forth their children as flock. Their little ones dance about. They sing to the music of timbrel and lyre. They make merry to the sound of the pipe. They spend their years in prosperity and go down to the grave in peace. Yet they say to God, 'Leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways.' Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? But their prosperity is not in their own hands. So I stand aloof from the plans of the wicked. Yet how often is the lamp of the wicked snuffed out? How often does calamity come upon them, the fate God allots in his anger? How often are they like straw before the wind, like chaff swept away by a gale? It is said, God stores up the punishment of the wicked for their children. Let him repay the wicked so that they themselves will experience it. Let their own eyes see their destruction. Let them drink the cup of the wrath of the Almighty. For what do they care about the families they leave behind when their allotted months come to an end? Can anyone teach knowledge to God, since he judges even the highest? One person dies in full vigor, completely secure and at ease, well nourished in body, bones rich with marrow. Another dies in bitterness of soul, never having enjoyed anything good. Side by side they lie in the dust, and worms cover them both. I know full well what you are thinking, the schemes by which you would wrong me. You say, where now is the house of the great, the tents where the wicked lived? Have you never questioned those who travel? Have you paid no regard to their accounts? That the wicked are spared from the day of calamity, that they are delivered from the day of wrath. Who denounces their conduct to their face? Who repays them for what they have done? They are carried to the grave, and watch is kept over their tombs. The soil in the valley is sweet to them. Everyone follows after them, and a countless throng goes before them. So how can you counsel me with your nonsense? Nothing is left of your answers but falsehood. And so you hear Job really arguing his case at this point. And perhaps you've, in the last couple of weeks, as we've considered Job's responses, how he very often will consider himself in his position before God. But here, for the first time, it really feels like he's built an argument, and he's now turning toward the friends, and he's actually arguing. He is stating his case, and he's considering his case in light of what he has seen, what he has witnessed, how he understands the world to look around him. And as we begin, we're going to pick up just from the beginning and see how he unpacks this argument. So turning to Job 21 verse 2 and 3, the argument begins. But he first says to them, he says to the friends, listen carefully to my words. Let this be the consolation you give me. Bear with me while I speak, and after I have spoken, mock on. So he's giving them an option. There's perhaps a bit of tongue-in-cheek here. He's either saying, listen to what I say, learn from what I'm saying, and help or be informed on how to counsel me, and say to me what I need to hear. Or he is simply saying, listen, even though you're not going to listen, and then when I'm done, you can carry on mocking me. But at the heart of what Job is saying here is he is giving them the ability to hear what he has to say and really see things from a slightly different angle. And also, he is giving them something that they can then turn back to him and say, Job, this is actually true, and we are going to counsel you through this. We're going to help you through this, because this is true. In verse 4, he then says, is my complaint directed to a human being? Why should I not be impatient? And obviously that's going to be on one of your questions. Why has he said that? Is that right? Well, it should leave us a little bit uncomfortable. Can that be true? Can he say that? We know that his complaint hasn't been against the friends, other than him actually being frustrated that they aren't pointing him to God, that they aren't helping him in a way that is helpful, that is true. But the fact is that he is being honest. He's again saying his complaint, he's asking the question, has my complaint been against human beings? Well, the answer is no. His complaint, his frustration, his confusion, his wrestling has been with God. And so he says, why should I not be impatient? He is saying, well, if there's any place to go, I can seek God. And I think it is the weight of what he is saying there that conveys that he is desperately seeking God's answer. He's desperately seeking to gain understanding in the situation because he's in pain, he's suffering, he doesn't understand what's going on, and he desperately wants to understand. He desperately wants to know, what is this all about? The next thing that we can pick up is just verses 5. As he looks to the friends, he says, "Look at me and be appalled. Clap your hand over your mouth." So look at me, be in disgust, cover your mouth, because you almost cannot believe what you are seeing when you look at me. And then he reflects on himself as he's about to say something. He says in verse 6, "When I think about this, I'm terrified. Trembling seizes my body." And so Job is now giving us, he's about to share with us something that seizes him with trembling, that frightens him, that as he considers it, he is perplexed, but he is also terrified by just the reality of it. And so we move into what's a section here, and that section is verses 7 through to 15. And 7 through to 15, as we see in verse 7, just to highlight what it's about, it says, "Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in power?" And so this whole section from 7 to 15 is about the wicked. He's asking this question. He says, if you consider the wicked, if you consider them, there are those wicked ones that live prosperous lives. They live fantastic lives. They live lives better than I've lived. And God doesn't do anything about it. God doesn't wipe them out. God doesn't take them away. God doesn't take everything from them. They're cattle and give birth to calves. And so he unpacks it. He says, notice in 10, the bulls never fail to breed. Their cows calve and do not miscarry. And not only the cattle, but then he goes further. He says in verse 11, they send forth their children as a flock. Their little ones dance about. And then verse 12, it says, they sing to music of the timbrel and lyre. They make merry to the sound of the pipe. And so this starts merging into even their own lives, the children that they have. So not only their cattle, but their own offspring, their own life, their own children. And so you have this picture that is painted of the wicked, the evil people that are prospering. And if that's not enough, it says in verse 13, they spend their years in prosperity and go down to the grave in peace. And so that's a complete contrast of where Job currently is. Job was in a position of prosperity. He had a good life. He had many servants. He had many children. He had many possessions. He was incredibly wealthy, and he lost it all. And where he is sitting in dust and ash. He's absolutely grief-stricken, and on top of that, he is not at peace. He is hard-pressed. He's struggling. He's struggling to deal with all that's happening in his life. And he says, if you look at the wicked, there are those that spend their years in prosperity, and they go down to the grave in peace. Far better than where I am. If I have to die now, I'm dying filled with sorrow and dread. And that's a picture that we get in contrast. And then he says this in verse 14, because again it creates a deeper contrast as to who Job is. Job being a man that is upright, that is a blameless and upright man that fears God and shuns evil. And then you get this picture of the wicked. Verse 14, yet they say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Verse 15, who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? The wicked say we have it all. The wicked say that they don't need anything else. They don't need God. They've had a good life. So why would we need the Almighty, is what the wicked say. And just to pause there, this is not foreign for us today. We can look out in the world and you see a strange thing taking place in the world around us. Strange according to our heart's desires. Strange according to what we as human beings long for. As human beings, we long for a level of prosperity. We long for a life that is good and pleasing and comfortable and peaceable. And as humans, though we may long for it, as Christians, we may experience something entirely different. As Christians, we face this world where things are upside down. You have genuinely fantastic Christians, living good lives, fearing God, shunning evil, trying to have a great life of service to God. And yet their life is stricken with hardship, difficulties, pain, suffering. While their next door neighbor is completely secular, living a life entirely the way they want to, with no regard about who the Lord is. They live their lives and they say at the end, why do we need to know the Almighty? Look at our lives. We've had a good life. What more is He going to add? What more value is He going to add to our lives? And we have this tension in this world today where you have people that we would regard as upright, blameless, just, however you want to put it, from what we can see. And then on the other side, you have those that are absolutely the complete opposite. And yet, they prosper and they thrive. But then Job makes an interesting comment here. Despite all of that, despite whether you live a good life or a bad life, and despite whether you have prosperity or you are in dust and ash, Job says in verse 16, but their prosperity is not in their own hands. So I stand aloof from the plans of the wicked. I don't want to know it. I don't want to know their plans. Because at the end of the day, though they have prosperity now, that prosperity is not theirs. There will come a time when judgment will take place. And this isn't what Job is dealing with here. He's not dealing with when that judgment comes. He is simply arguing with his friends and he's saying, look at this world that we live in. You say that if suffering happens to you, you have done wicked things. So your argument has been, up until now, for the last 2 cycles in Job, the friend's argument has been, if you are suffering, if you're facing hardship, it is a result of you being a wicked or a bad person. And Job says, consider this, there are some that are wicked, and yet they thrive, they prosper now. At this point in time, they thrive and they prosper. So how is that possible? You say that because I'm suffering, I am wicked or evil, or I've done something. But there are people around me, people in this world that do terrible things, and yet they prosper. But Job is, as much as that terrifies him that this can be the case, as much as this terrifies him and causes his body to tremble, he considers it, and he has one consolation in that verse 16, when he is able to say, but at the end of the day, their prosperity is not their own. It's not in their own hands. And Job knows that, because him being someone that is blameless and upright, that fears God and shuns evil, he knows that his own prosperity was never his own. Whether he is good or bad, upright or a sinner through and through, maybe he was just, he did know one thing, that what he had was not his own. And so he says, if anything, I'll rather stand back and be oblivious to the plans of the wicked, to choose not to know them, than to follow them. And then he has this further bunch of questions that he asks from verse 17. He says here, yet how often is the lamp of the wicked snuffed out? How often does the calamity come upon them, the fate God allots in his anger? How often are they like straw before the wind, like chaff swept away by a gale? And so Job is turning to the friends and he's saying, honestly, tell me now, how often does this really happen? How often does God bring about judgment upon the wicked, like you say he does? You say, I have sinned and I have suffered at the hand of what I've done and at the hand of God. But how often does that really happen? Because if I look at the world, I see people that aren't upright. I see wicked people prospering. And then verse 19 onwards, he says, it is said, God stores up the punishment of the wicked for their children. Let him repay the wicked so that they themselves will experience it. Let their own eyes see their destruction. Let them drink the cup of wrath of the Almighty. For what do they care about the families they leave behind when their allotted months come to an end? And Job, at this point, he's saying, let that destruction actually come upon the wicked. Let it happen. Let them see the suffering that they bring. But in light of what Job has said, the reality is that often the case is that the wicked who perform wicked and prosper at the hand of their wickedness will not see the judgment that is afflicted upon their families. They will go to the grave in peace, and their family will later on suffer. And so what's strange here is Job is saying, again, even if that is the case, it would be my children that would experience my suffering, and I would have gone to the grave at peace to some degree. But yet Job is saying it's not that simple. You say that if I am wicked, then this is why I'm suffering, or why I'm suffering is because I'm wicked. But Job is saying, but I will say to you that there are those that are wicked and prosper, and only their children at a later stage will suffer. Judgment will come, but it is seldom that it is in the way we think it will come. And then we get to verses 22, and he builds this argument. And so let's pick up verses 22 to 26. He says here, can anyone teach knowledge to God, since he judges even the highest? One person dies in full vigor, completely secure and at ease, well nourished in body, bones rich with marrow. Another dies in bitterness of soul, never having enjoyed anything good. Side by side they lie in the dust, and worms cover them both. And the picture that Job paints here is, in one sense, really a straightforward and simple picture. He says in verses 22 to 26, firstly he begins by saying, can anyone teach knowledge to God, since he judges even the highest? So he's saying, okay, we are sitting here, we can have this intellectual argument, but we can't teach God. God is the one that is all-knowing. He understands everything on a level that we don't. We can't teach. And the irony of it is that as much as we could know here, God knows far more. And not only that, but the one that might know the most will end up in the grave, like the one that knows the least. And so he shifts from this idea of knowledge, that the one that might have knowledge that you would almost consider on a level with God's knowledge, he says even the highest will end up in the grave. One person dies in full vigor, completely secure and at ease. One person dies in prosperity, in a good life, and he dies at ease, while another, while his body is well nourished and his bones are rich with marrow. He's actually fat. He's indulged in life. He's enjoyed life, is the picture that we are painted. And then verse 25, another dies in bitterness of soul, never having enjoyed anything good. And he says the outcome is that both will end up in the grave. Both good and bad. They will both end up in the same place where worms will cover their body. And so this is the picture that Job is pushing here. And keeping in mind what the friends have been saying, Job, you have sin in your life. You've done something wrong to get this judgment. You're getting what you deserve. And then Job says this. Again, Job digs deeper. He considers where their minds are running. And he says in verse 27, I know full well what you are thinking, the schemes by which you would wrong me. And you say, where now is the house of the great, the tents where the wicked lived? So he's saying, I know what you're thinking. You're listening to my argument and you're saying, okay, Job, fine. You say all of this about some of the wicked prospering, but where is their house? Where are their possessions? Where are their tents? They're not here. We don't see them. And then Job makes this interesting comment in verse 29. He says, have you never questioned those who travel? The word there is one on the road. It's an idea of someone that moves. And so the picture may paint for us two things. Either it's a person that lives a prosperous life while traveling the land, or it could be a picture of someone that is actually a foreigner to this land. Have you ever considered the lives of those that are foreigners to this land? Have you paid no regard to their accounts? So he's now challenging these friends. He's saying, this is our world that we live in our framework of thinking. And he's saying, you've brought me this argument where you say, look at our world. Look at the people around us. This is what we've been taught. This is what our fathers have taught us. And Job is saying, great, that might be true, but have you considered other stories? Have you considered stories that are outside of our people group, outside of our borders? And Job is suddenly thinking bigger. He's seeing a bigger picture, and he's saying, have you paid no regard to their accounts? And then he goes on in verse 30, he says, that the wicked are spared from the day of calamity, that they are delivered from the day of wrath. And he goes on to eventually say that they even lie in the tomb, and they go down into the valley where they rest, and the ground is sweet. As he says in verse 33, the soil in the valley is sweet to them. Everyone follows after them, and a countless throng goes before them. And so Job's argument here is he's saying, in many ways we could almost put it slightly differently. He says, don't be so narrow-minded. Have you considered a bigger picture? That there are cases outside of our borders, of people that have traveled. Have you listened to their stories? Of those that have prospered and had good lives, and that have gone to the grave in peace. And so this is the argument that Job is throwing back at them, saying, don't be so quick to say that my suffering is a result of my unrighteousness. Remember, we know who Job is. We are told who Job is. Job has an understanding of his position before God, that he is blameless, that he is upright. He fears God and he shuns evil. And the argument that the friends have brought contradicts the person that we know Job to be. Job is suffering for no reason. Maybe you've been struggling to accept that. But Job gives a good argument here, and you just need to go and look outside. Look at the world around us, not your community, not your neighborhood, not your people group, not your church members, but look at the world around us. There are many people that are prospering. They live lives that are absolutely devoid of God, and they prosper. They're at peace. They're enjoying life. And you've got a lot of Christians, those that are close to home, maybe even family members that are suffering, struggling. And yet they are devoted to God, seeking Jesus, turning to Him, praying, longing for that peace that can only truly be found in Christ. And so Job puts this on the table. He throws it out there and he says, what do you make of that? And that's where those words that Jesus uses reminds us of something like this in Job 21. That God will make the sun rise on both the wicked and the upright. And He brings rain for the just and the unjust. That just because a person is wicked or evil doesn't change who God is and what He does. God will continue to provide and let things unfold. Ultimately, however, God will bring judgment. That is without a doubt. But in the context of where we're wrestling here in Job, this is not the judgment that awaits Job, and that we see from the introduction that we are given to Job. And so Job concludes this passage as he turns to his friends and he says, so how can you counsel me with your nonsense? Nothing is left of your answers but falsehood. Job is saying with this argument, what I'm saying to you now, it breaks down your argument, your counsel, and it proves you wrong. Because God is not functioning in the way that you think He functions. Going back to verse 22, can anyone teach knowledge to God, since He judges even the highest? God is going to judge all things. But don't be so quick to think that you know how God is judging. So don't look at my life. Job says, don't look at my life and think you know that how God is judging me. I turn to God. I plead to Him. I pray to Him. I'm devoted to Him, and yet you say that I'm suffering because of my wickedness? Saying, but I've seen a lot of wicked people prospering that do not want to know God at all. So how does that fit in with your framework? And so at this point, we need to come to a pause and come to the end of what Job is saying here and conclude with a few thoughts. As we look at this passage for us today, it is true. There is so much in it that we can relate to. As I said, and hopefully we've taken a moment to just consider it, the people, the lives, the world around us paints this picture. It paints a picture that there is many people that live wicked or lives in one sense devoid of turning to God or longing for Him, and yet they prosper. And there are those that seek Him wholeheartedly and suffer. And so to simply say that the life that you are experiencing is a result of the life that you are living is an oversimplification. And we as Christians shouldn't be imposing that on people, but should be pointing people to God. Rather than think that we understand how God's judgment is working or try and find out why people are suffering, we need to be able to freely point people to Jesus Christ. Because that's where we need to, and that's the only place that we can point people to. Because our answers are going to be fallible. Our answers are going to break down. Our answers are going to become falsehoods if we think we understand how God governs His creation. And the only thing that we can truly stand on, that we can truly know, is the promise that God has given us through His Son Jesus Christ. That no matter what we deserve, that in Christ we can be set free. And it becomes once again a situation where God turns everything on its head because of His Son Jesus Christ. So let's point people to Christ rather than to our own knowledge and try and solve people's problems. Let's offer them Christ. So have a think about that and wrestle with it over the next week. I'll see you back here next week. Cheers, bye.